Hello everyone, and welcome back to Inside ArtScroll, where the books you read and the people who write them come to life. Today we are privileged to be joined by Rabbi Yaakov Feitman, the longtime Rav of Kehillas Bais Yehuda Tzvi of Cedarhurst, and the author of the brand new ArtScroll book, Blueprints. Thank you, Rabbi Feitman, for joining us.
Thank you, Rabbi Hissiger. It's a pleasure to be here in the land of ArtScroll.
First of all, I must ask, how are the Rav and Rebbitzin feeling?
Baruch Hashem, we're all post-COVID. The Rebbitzin can still use a refuah shalema, so this would be a schus for her for refuah shalema.
Amen. Yeshev arichas yomim v'shanim.
Amen.
And thank you for coming out to beautiful ArtScroll headquarters for this conversation. We're very excited about the release of your new book, Blueprints. So let's start there before we delve into the background, before we talk about your blueprint. What was the goal in writing this book, and how did you compile it?
So the truth is that this goal, as you say, and the book itself has been germinating somewhere in the back of my head and my heart and other places for many, many years, probably decades. I've always felt that there's a Zohar HaKadosh in Parshas Truma. It's mentioned in the introduction to the book. Istakel boiraisa ubara alma. Everybody knows the line. Hashem created the world, but before he created the world, he wrote the Torah. Then he looked into the Torah, and he created the world. So what is that? That's a blueprint. Kadosh Baruch Hu made the blueprint, and then he looked into the blueprint. So I've always felt that there are many, many daily examples of that you can look into the Torah, and all of a sudden, a light pops up, a light shines, and you understand something that not only you never understood before, but most of the world has never understood before. And that's really the essence of the book. The entire book is all about blueprints that will help us to understand the world.
Now, you are currently also a Yated columnist, where your column appears every week, and the style of the book kind of mirrors the style of your columns, where you intersperse some very deep thoughts from your yeshivah, Rav Yitzchak Hutner, as well as other Gedolei Torah, and you share stories and vignettes and insights. Walk us through how you compile your articles, and in this case, the chapters, of being able to balance sometimes heavy material with really light and enlightening and easy to read type of stories and anecdotes.
So the truth is that a good deal of the book, but not all of the book, was published already, not in this exact form, because there's a lot of chidush in the way that the book was published, and under the auspices of ArtScroll, it kept getting better and better through various editors, especially Mrs. Heimowitz, writing from Eretz Yisrael, but very wonderful people, Rabbi Zlotowitz, of course. So when they began, some of them began in Mishpacha, some of them, as you said, in the Ated, the last couple of years, and then there's others that are totally new. So what really happens to me is, I either read about something or I hear about something either on the radio or some other medium. Now that I've published, Baruch Hashem, very often in all of these media, in the Ated and Mishpacha, people send me things. Sometimes now my own children send me things. And when I see something, I say, the Torah talks about that. And then I try in my mind to come up, usually it's a Chazal. The Chazal gives birth to the Rishonim give birth to the Achronim on that subject, and all of a sudden, bingo, there's an article. So the key over here is that articles have a certain limitation. You can't write more than, I'm sure you've heard this from Rabbi Lipschitz often, and your own articles are beautifully short. Mine are unfortunately a little bit longer, but they tend to be around 1,500, 1,600 words. So each one of the chapters or of the subjects, the columns, are about that long. They try to examine a world phenomenon that everybody's talking about. If you want, I'll give you some examples. Sports, for instance, music, other things in the world, and what the world philosophers or theologians say about it, and then we try to look with Torah eyes at what the Torah says about it.
Now, what I liked about the way the book is formulated is that you start each chapter with a blueprint and then an application. So before the reader even attempts to read the chapter, they know kind of what your direction is going to be, and that kind of helps them navigate it.
I think that's something that I learned actually from the Ated and wonderful places like that. There's a teaser. And it's supposed to be a little bit of a farshbais, an appetizer, so that people will want to read this. And the key is that it's practical. It's pragmatic and hopefully helps people in their lives.
Absolutely. So, speaking of blueprints, anyone who's read your writings, and I want to tell you, the other day I was somehow looking through some old archived articles from years ago, and I see Rabbi Feitman, an article from the 1980s in the Jewish Observer, and here I am, I'm thinking to myself, I was probably 2-3 years old when that article came out, and Kenai Nahari, you're still writing so many years later, using the medium of writing and language.
I'll get it one of these days. I'm working on it. One of these days I'll get there.
You'll get it right. Baruch Hashem, you've done a wonderful job. Your blueprint of your life, people who have read your writings know that you're a very prominent Talmud of Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner at Yeshivas Rabbeinu Chaim Berlin. Many people may not know how you got there. Could you provide some background where you grew up and where you spent your formative years before you got to Rav Hutner?
Well, I was actually born in Germany almost right after the war, 1948, and my parents, Aleim Shalom, sent me to Chaim Berlin, and eventually I actually went to Yeshiva of Eastern Parkway for a while, for Mesivta, but even Yeshiva of Eastern Parkway, which was an outgrowth, we've recently all been also commemorating the yahrzeit of Rabbi Silber Zatzal. So Rabbi Silber was also a Talmud of the Rosh Yeshiva, and when the Yeshiva Eastern Parkway Mesivta began, the Yeshiva, unlike he went out of his comfort zone, he never spoke outside of the yeshiva. He said a mimer in the yeshiva, and it changed my life. He said one of the mimarim that's printed in the Igrois Uksavim Pachad Yitzchak was called Toiv Lagever Kisa'el Ben Urav, and it changed my life. I had to get to know him. And then Reb Motl Weinberg Zatzal was also my Rosh Yeshiva and my Rebbe.
At Eastern Parkway.
At Eastern Parkway. And he sent me to go talk to the Rosh Yeshiva in learning. So I was petrified.
How old were you at the time?
12.
Well.
12.
Okay.
12 years old. 12-year-olds should actually not go to see Rav Hutner. It was probably not a good idea. I was petrified. So I'll just tell you one funny story that I've never actually told, but that gave me a taste of what was going to happen for many, many decades afterwards. So I said a shtickle Torah, and I was very proud of it, because I said a chiddush on top of Reb Shimon Shkop. But I didn't say Shkop. I said, Un Reb Shimon zogt. And I remember the Yeshiva said to me, Welche Reb Shimon, bar yoichoi? So he knew exactly what I was saying. But the edge in his voice told me that, first of all, I should have said the Mishnah and the Gemara and maybe a Rishon, and then gotten to a Reb Shimon Shkop. And second of all, who do you think you are saying over Reb Shimon Shkop? So I got all that instantly. But it opened up a doorway, actually a passage that really, Baruch Hashem, still continues in my learning from Rav Hutner Zatzal.
So you meet Rav Hutner at age 12. You make your attempt at sharing a Reb Shimon. What was the next step?
So the next step was that he called me back. I was just supposed to say something that Reb Motl Weinberg wanted me to say, which was Reb Shimon Shkop in Masechta Ksubis. But then the Yeshiva called me back. I was astounded, and somehow or other, almost the next, I was a little bit older then at that time, I was a teenager, and he was also asking me already to translate my marim and to submit them to him.
He was already at that young age?
Yes. So that when I was a little bit older than in mid-20s, so he was asking me to translate things that he either told me privately, one-on-one, and then the real part of that connection and that relationship was when he spoke to the Menahalim. That was the famous non-Holocaust talk, right, because he didn't like the word Holocaust, but he said the Churban Europa wasn't even a mimer. It was a teaching moment for all the Menahalim, and then Rabbi Chaim Feitman, Zechronu Livracha, and I translated it, but then Chaim gave it over to me to edit as per the Rosh Yeshiva.
So I want to get to the Holocaust piece, which is a historic, seminal piece from the Rosh Yeshiva. But let's go back again. You're a teenager. You joined Chaim Berlin,
right,
9th grade.
Right. No, 9th grade, actually. 9th through 12th, I was in Yeshiva
Eastern Parkway.
And then I went for one Zaman after that.
But you had spoken to Rav Hutner at age 12 when you were still... at Eastern Parkway?
I was still at Eastern Parkway, right.
So it wasn't until later that you finally joined Chaim Berlin.
Right.
Then, how did Rav Hutner know that you had an ability to put into writing, to his satisfaction, his Torah?
That's a wonderful question. Ad hayom hazeh, I don't know the answer, but we conversed, and we conversed in Yiddish. But every once in a while, he would throw me an English word, and then I had to respond in English because it was the way that he was speaking to me was required an English language response. And then I am assuming that based upon that, he derived or deduced that I could write. And then much later, he gave me something. It was a very difficult thing to do. He gave me something that somebody else had translated, and I knew this wasn't his style. Mm-hmm. So he asked me, "Was hältst du von dem? What do you think of it?" It was very difficult because I was much younger than the person that had translated it. And I said, it was very accurate. So he said, "Yankel, accurate is the correct word, but I believe he may have used the word poetry. I think that was the first time I heard the word poetry from him. But is it also poetry?" So I said, "Mistamanat." Mm-hmm. And then he asked me to rewrite the whole thing. So he told me at the time, the line was, he didn't even look at me. He was like, I think, talking to himself, I think. But he was too smart to just do that, knowing that I was listening, so it was for me also. Said, "Ich red zu sie poetry und sie wach für mir prose." And he didn't want that. It's obviously the Mamorim are beautiful poetry, poetic. And by the way, the letters, if you go through the Igros of the Rosh Yeshiva Zatzal, when he was a teenager, he wrote like, I don't want to say Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, I don't know if that's the comparison, but he wrote like an elder poet.
Wow.
It was incredible. And he was just writing letters to his parents.
And he didn't want that to be lost in translation, that beautiful poetic style. But what's interesting is that he critiqued your writings in English, even though English wasn't his mother tongue. And there's a story in my family that it's told over that my grandfather, Rabbi Tzvi Harry Hiziger, who was an East New Yorker, when he heard that the yeshiva came to America, the first thing he did was make a beeline to his in-laws' house, the yeshiva's in-laws, and he walked in and found Rav Hutner holding a dictionary, teaching himself English. So I think it's fascinating that the yeshiva had that ability, that knack for language, to master a language that wasn't his mother tongue, as I mentioned, and to be able to critique it, and he knew what he was looking for.
You know, the Rosh Yeshiva Zatzal, this may be famous, I don't know, but maybe a lot of people don't know this. The Rosh Yeshiva wrote a perush on Rabbeinu Hillel on Safra. And not only a perush on it, but parts of it that were almost not published, maybe they weren't published. So he taught himself an Italian script. It was written in an Italian script, and he taught it to himself. So I remember once he said to me, we were talking about, I asked him if I could go to college. My parents wanted me to go to college. I was the child of Holocaust survivors, and they were all worried. So he said, "It's not necessary. Ich bin doch ein autodidact," he said. But if you go to college, you won't know that word. So that was, an autodidact, for those that don't know, is a self-taught person. So he was telling me basically that you don't need college even to be an educated person. And that he taught himself that Italian script, and I think more than that, I think he may have actually taught himself Italian at the time, I don't remember, just to be able to publish the Rabbeinu Hillel on Safra.
Wow. Now, how often was he asking the Rav to write his writings in English? How often did that come up? So
in the early years, not that much, but much later, I think it may have begun in the 1970s. I published a translation of a Sephardi Sefer on the Eser Makos. So it's called Out of the Iron Furnace. I believe it's out of print, but people spend a lot of money for some reason. It's a translation of Rebbe Eliezer ben David. And I gave one to the Rosh Yeshiva, and after that, he started calling me a lot. Mm-hmm. And that led us to the Holocaust, one that you alluded to that we'll talk about later, and other things as well that he asked me to translate.
Now, the seminal piece on the Holocaust was really the Rosh Yeshiva's view on a period of time that I guess people of that generation were grappling with, to understand the Torah Hashkafa, to understand how it should be taught. What was it like when you sat down with the yeshiva and he first presented to you what he wanted? And what was the process of putting that together?
Well, the process actually was initially easy, and then it became much more difficult. The yeshiva spoke. This was a spoken thing, and as I said, Rabbi Feitman, Zatzal, took excellent notes. And he gave me his notes, and I had my own. I really did not take notes. I was just listening very intently at the time. So the yeshiva wanted something more, a little bit more poetry, as I said, and also he wanted to add some material that was not in the original. So he said to me, Yankel, come to my house on such and such a day. It was, I forgot what day it was, but I will never forget, we spent 7 hours on this in a row. And it turned out I was very sick that day. The yeshiva told me when to come. I had a very high fever. And somewhere along the way, he said to me, Yaakov, was it mit dir was? I said, Rebbe, I don't feel well. So he said, geh heim. So after the 7 hours, so I came back a few days later when I was feeling better, and then we did more. And there was a total of probably, I would imagine, like at least 10 hours of total discussion about it. And he asked me to submit a manuscript on this, which he critiqued, both on substance, style, and language, as you mentioned.
What year was this?
And,
what year are we talking?
1970s, probably 77, something like that.
So it's only 4 years before his Patira.
Yes, it was a couple of years before the Patira, right? 77, I believe that's what it was. And then it was published to some acclaim and to a great deal of criticism and a great deal of emotion. Really? Because the yeshiva didn't pull any punches, and he blamed whoever he felt had to be blamed, and he defended the Gedolei Yisrael. And in fact, he told me privately, but then later on we printed, I'll tell you in a minute how that happened, that the whole reason that he said that mimer to all the Menalim was to defend the covet of the rosh yeshivas and Rabbanim and Admoirim that did not tell everybody to leave Europe.
So give us a synopsis of that was his goal in writing. What's a synopsis of that particular piece?
Well, there are many parts to it. I'll focus maybe on one of them. So one opinion of the so-called Holocaust, he didn't like that word, and I'll start with that, was because his thesis and his Das Torah was that you can't give an event in Jewish history a name of its own. And he said nobody ever did it before. There was Tach V'Tat, there was the Spanish Inquisition and expulsion, the Crusades, but these were secular names. Our name for everything is Churban, and therefore there's a continuum, a connection between all the Churbanos. So he said if you want to say Holocaust, and that's this particular 39 to 45 years, so you have to also say Churban Europa. And by the way, he was pale. He actually accomplished what, I won't say everybody, but many of the schools that afterwards started teaching what's called Holocaust studies switched it to Churban Europa. All the better Bais Yaakovs and the yeshivas that dealt with this.
Not the Shoah. The Shoah was...
No, Shoah he didn't like either. Yeah, because Shoah also, in fact, the reason that he didn't like the word Shoah, because Shoah, he said, is a sudden eruption. It's like an earthquake or a volcano. It's a tempest, but it's not a continuation of events that the Rebbeinu Shalom brings upon Klal Yisrael. His line was, which I wrote and translated, "Es liegt of Yidden a Teichacha." So Teichacha results in Churban if we don't listen. There's of course in B'chukoisei Telechu and then Chas v'Shalom in B'chukoisei Loi Telechu. So his point was. And he felt that this is such a yesod that everybody has to know and live with. And he said, fathers have to teach it to their children, mothers have to teach it to their children, that we have resting upon our shoulders, Klal Yisrael, this teichacha. And therefore there's no blame. You can't do blame. And in this, he was critical, but we didn't say names, of those Gedolim that said, kind of like he didn't like the mipnei chato'enu, even though that's what the Torah says. But the Yeshiva said that we're not Nevi'im to pinpoint which Aveira results in which Einish, in which punishment. So therefore, his point was that there is in Jewish history a moment that we all of a sudden, the Rebbeinu Shalom decides to, it might be a cumulative effect, to bring upon us something terrible, but you can't blame that generation necessarily. And that went against many other very wonderful people. He didn't have anything against them other than he disagreed with them on this point. But the problem was that some of the survivors did not take it well, even though he never blamed them. On the contrary, he told me when I started going into chinuch and then on the verge of going into Rabbanis, I didn't actually go into Rabbanis when he was alive, but I was toying with it, and he gave me guidelines and rules and regulations. So he told me never talk to survivors about this, because they can't handle it emotionally, and just coddle them and love them and give them chizuk.
So this was for the next generation to understand the proper hashkafa of it. And once it was written and the yeshiva approved it, now you were going to disseminate it. How did you do that?
So what happened was like this. It was an article in the Jewish Observer, and by Rabbi Chaim Feitman and Yaakov Feitman, and it went all over the world. It was like what they would call today viral. They didn't say that word in those days. Now it means everything else. But it went all over the place, and there was a great deal of criticism. Mostly people did not understand it. They reacted viscerally, and the yeshiva did a chazara, what he called a chazara on the mimer. And that, I think by then Rabbi Feitman wasn't involved, and then I translated and wrote that. So,
like a rebuttal, almost like a rebuttal
yes,
to the critique?
but the Yeshiva didn't want it to be read as a rebuttal. So in the process of Chazara, and he said to me, "Ven mechazet lernt men weiter," and there's new things. So then that I wrote up by myself. When Rabbi Wolpin, Zechronu Livracha, published this in the book, which was called A Path Through the Ashes, and it's a wonderful book. Forget about this. I mean, it's the yeshiva, but it's also Rav Gifter is in there, and many other wonderful Gedolei Yisrael. So the yeshiva's piece is not separated from the Chazara. It becomes footnotes. So that and the yeshiva proved that derech, and he looked it over and he gave his approval, and he gave me a big yashar koach. I just want to tell you one little vignette. So he wanted to pay me back. So he called me in and he liked the whole thing. He said, "Ich will du batzon." And I started to babble because I didn't, I said, "Du yeshiva darf man nicht batzon. Wisst nicht hören a shtickl Torah?" So he told me a mimer, basically for myself, which I don't think he ever said publicly.
In appreciation for your efforts.
Right.
That was his payment, so to speak.
That was the payment. And I've used it many times.
A private mimer to
private
you
mimer.
On what topic?
The topic was in Parashat Shlach. So it says in Parashat Shlach, I'm just telling you the vignette, the basics. In Parashat Shlach it says, well, it's really on a pasuk in Tehillim, and it comes from Shlach. David HaMelech in Kuf Hey and Kuf Vav in Tehillim reviews many things in Chumash. So when it comes to Meraglim, it says, "Vayisa Yada Lahem Lahapuloisam Ba'Goyim Ulzaroisam Ba'Rotzes." That means that the punishment for the Meraglim was basically Golus. He said, "Tzishteitnish." It doesn't say any place in Chumash. So he had a pshat, he had a mahalach, he told it to me, and to my knowledge, he's never said it publicly because it was my gift. But then when I was finished, I asked him, can I say it over? He said, "Sivet kummen de Zeit." It was so amazing because he understood that I'm going to need it in Rabbanis.
Wow.
And because it's a very beautiful pshat, of course.
So that piece that the yeshiva told you privately did not appear in Pachad Yitzchak in any of the volumes?
I don't think it's any place.
Wow.
To my knowledge.
And to the Rav's knowledge, how many other people in the world were zeichet to get a private mimer with Rav Hutner?
I really don't know, but I was zeiche, and I cried. I cried tears of simcha.
Wow.
That I was zeiche to this.
It's definitely a reflection of the ahava, besides the appreciation, but the ahava that the yeshiva had for you was obviously extraordinary, and you were zeichet to spend so many hours with him, one-on-one, getting a glimpse of the yeshiva that many people maybe were not zeichet to. And that's a segue to something that I wanted to ask you, if it's okay.
Sure, please.
People talk about the yeshiva with a certain mysterious nature, a mystique. There was a mystique people who knew Rav Hutner all
Right.
talk about it. But the Rav was zeichet to see what we'll call a human side of Rav Hutner. If you don't mind spending a moment talking about that, and maybe even a story or two that really reflects that persona of Rav Hutner that maybe wasn't as publicly recognized.
Well, there are numerous stories. I had personal experiences with him where he shed the mystique, the mystical persona, and it was just guiding me through my personal life. He knew that both of my parents had been nifter before he passed away, before he was nifter, so he knew that I was a yasam. And which I will not go into all of that right now for many reasons, but he acknowledged my yasmos and spoke about what it means to be a yasam and how to overcome the downsides of yasmos and how to turn it around. And I'll never forget. Later, I heard that this was one of his. I wouldn't say the word mantra to apply to the Rosh Yeshiva, but one of his themes, one of his leitmotifs, was Sheva Yipol Tzadik V'Kam. So I think we're in ArtScroll, I have to be very careful, but he translated different than ArtScroll, because that's not the Pashut Pshat. So the usual translation of Sheva Yipol Tzadik V'Kam is that despite the fact that a tzaddik fell down 7 times, he'll get up. And the yeshiva told me, "Nein, weil der tzaddik is gefallen, kann stehen besser." Once you've fallen and you did get up, you're better than before. And he told me that in very personal ways that I don't want to say it's nevius, it was pikchus and it was ga'inus, but maybe there was a ruach hakodesh there, because he told me things that I've used since 4 decades ago. He told me this, and I continue to use it. And he told me once something I didn't understand. He says, "Ein adam," Gemara in the beginning of Avodah Zarah, "Ein adam oimen al das Rabbi ad aboin shnin, du haltst noch nicht dorten." So I probably, well, let's talk more, and
But
maybe
what
we'll
was
come back to it.
his pshat in Sheva Yipol Tzadik V'Kam? Would you say that's consistent with the Gemara of B'makom Shabali Chuvim Oimdim, that they reach a place that
Absolutely.
that was consistent with
Yes,
that message?
Absolutely. And one of the things that I've heard from many other people, but I certainly saw in my lifetime, was that he had the ability to pick people up, and he said that's because he experienced this. So there's something in the Sefer Zikarim that Rebbe David wrote over, which is so extraordinary. It's just a line or two, maybe not even 2 lines, 1.5 lines. He said that when he got up from Shiva, I believe for the Rebbetzin, Aleh Shalom, so he came out and there was a tree that, it was springtime, that had just blossomed. He said, "The Rebbeinu Shemot mir geschickt dem Baum, das ist für mein Avelus and for mein Atzvas." He said that was sent for him to bring him out of his almost, I think he said the word depression even, but certainly his Avelus. And it was put there for me.
Wow.
And that was one of the lessons that I learned from him, is that in life, we are sent messages by the Rebbeinu Shalom, and we have to know how to figure them out. Which, by the way, I think is in the blueprints a lot, things that I got from the yeshiva of that kind.
Well, the yeshiva is quoted in the book no less than, 25 times?
Something like that.
And the
It's definitely
yeshiva's
over
writings
25.
and thoughts permeate all your writings, so that's not a surprise at all. Has the Rav ever considered doing a work solely on Rav Hutner's Torah and his outlook and hashkafa, anything of that sort?
I have, and every time I start to do it, my hand trembles. Thank God I don't have tremors, but I have tremors every time I think about doing it. I have talked to various of the Chashuvei Chaim Berlin, and they have encouraged me to do it, as they encouraged me to do this book, and the Rosh Yeshivas, Olin Gezinstein, Reb Aaron, and Reb Yonason encouraged me very much, but I don't know. This yard site, we talked about this before a little bit, is the 40th yard site coming up in Kislev, Chav Kislev, the 40th yard site
Of Rav Hutner.
of Rav Hutner. I wrote about him on the 30th, and now I've been asked to write about him on the 40th, and I don't know if I'm any smarter than I was 10 years ago. But maybe around now, maybe I'll consider it a little bit more.
Before, when we were speaking privately, the Rav alluded to a story about the rosh yeshiva's hat.
Yes.
Will you take a moment to share that with our
I
viewers?
should tell the story. All right. So I was a young bacher. I was not yet married, and I had the schus of driving the Rosh Yeshiva around a little bit. So I drove him to a bris, and when we got out of the car, he gave me a hat. Yankel, nem dem hut. Carry his hat. Fine, no problem. Later on, I won't say who right now, but one of the Chashuvei Chaim Berlin, I told him the story. He said, Jetzt bist du geworden a Talmud. So let me just explain what that means. Now you have become a Talmud of the Yeshiva. Because the Yeshiva held, and he writes it in a number of Maimarim and Shavuos and other places in various letters in the Igros, that a Talmud, it's not enough at all to learn from the Rebbe. If you'll permit me, I'll tell you a tremendous pshat that he said, and I still don't understand it, but I say it over. So he said it's a parsha shlema in Tanakh. Because what happened was when Eliyahu Hanavi was going to go up to Shemayim, so Elisha was chasing him. And Elisha wanted to chap noch a bissel Torah, a little bit more Torah from the Rebbe. So Eliyahu Hanavi told him, Lech, shuv lech, ki meo sisi lecha. So he said something very cryptic, very enigmatic, that doesn't seem to make sense. Go, what have I ever done for you? What kind of a thing is that to say to your Talmud? And he had done a lot for him. So the Yeshiva said, you see that the relationship between a Rebbe and a Talmud has nothing to do with quid pro quo. It's not what you give, it's not what you've taught, it's essential and it's elemental. And it took me a while to pick that up, and I hope that I did, among other things, because the Yeshiva told me this word privately also. And what he meant was that the relationship has to be one of hanoah. And just to go back to the question that you had asked me about, going with the Rosh Yeshiva and being with the Rosh Yeshiva, the Rosh Yeshiva wanted people to enjoy him. I'll tell you just a line. I used it in the Gemara the other day in Daf Yomi. Some of the last Gemaras are about, in Shabbos, we just finished Masechta Shabbos, are about Hespedim, Maspidim. He hated Hespedim. He hated them with a passion. He felt that they were very often false, overblown. He said that it's not good for the masbid, it's not good for the person that was nifter. So I didn't hear this myself, but I heard it secondhand from somebody I trust. So he was at a levaya, and the masbid, the person that was speaking, he waxed very eloquent, but he forgot about the nifter. And he was saying Gemaras and Medrashim and beautiful stuff. So the Yeshiva, in something of a stage whisper, which knowing how smart the Rosh Yeshiva was, knew would be heard by other people. So he muttered to himself, Ameis idach osa behano. You're not allowed to benefit from the corpse. So he was very, very tough about those things.
Did you find that the rosh yeshiva was tempered in his praise even of, let's say, his Rebbe, let's say the Alter of Slobodka, or others, or was this just something that he felt about Hespedim?
Absolutely. He wrote about the Alter, and if one reads it these days, you can see that, for instance, he wrote to his parents a beautiful, moving letter about the Alter. But he said, what I mentioned before about Ein Adam Moedim Al Das Rabbi, he didn't say Adaboim Shne at that time. He said, after the Rebbe is nifty, brought all sorts of rayas. As a very young man, he wrote this, that after the Petira, there's an opening of the Tzinoris, there's an opening of the Shemayim, and the Rebbe is able to infiltrate you, so to speak, and get into your heart and get into your soul. And he said that happened to him. So that after the Alter was nifter, he now understood things that he never understood. And he explained some things at that time and over the years, many, many times. But he never mentions the Alter in I don't think, maybe once. Gedolim from previous Rabbi Salanti mentions by name, mentions very, very few by name. I think because he was very careful about all these Gedolim, not to overdo, not to underdo, just Dvarim Kavayos, they called it, to be exact.
Now, on a personal level, you've been in Rabbonis now for decades. You've been witness to the change of the world. You've been witness to the growth here. We're sitting at ArtScroll, the growth of ArtScroll in terms of Habatzas HaTorah that we've all benefited from. What do you see the major difference in being a Rav today and a Mechanech and having been a Magachir, Rebbe today from even just 20, 30 years ago?
That's an excellent, wonderful question, and I can only speak for myself. I don't speak. I used to be involved with Rabbanim, training younger Rabbanim and things like that, but I haven't done that in a while, so I don't really know. But I can just tell you my sense of it, and that is that there was a time when Rabbanim could get up and give Musar, and that was their job. And in fact, we find that many of those that wrote about Rabbanis over the centuries and even millennia said that we're like the Nevi'im of old, and there's a Yeshai, does this, and there's a Yirmiyah, and we also have to do things like that. Today, we have to be mechazik people. And through the chizuk, and through the ava, and through the simchas hachayim, that we help them, they hopefully will grow. But the straight, old-fashioned, powerful Musar, because the Rav is such an eloquent speaker, doesn't hold anymore. The yeshiva had a line on this, by the way. It's very interesting. He said that he lamented a little bit that there's no more great speakers anymore. But he said, Bazei is euch nicht. So he told me privately, and he mentioned, he knew everything that went on in the Jewish world. So he mentioned two of the famous...
Who did he mean by Zay?
So he meant the Reform
and
famous orators. He mentioned two of them to me. I was shocked that he knew who they were. But he had them right. He understood them perfectly. So he said that there's a mahalach. I later found it in Reb Tzadok. I think that's what he was referring to. That there's always an equation between our enemies and ourselves. So when there is, for instance, there's a Moshe Rabbeinu, there's going to be a Bilam, and vice versa. And by the Tanoim, so there were the great philosophers, and we had the Chachmei HaTorah. But each time that there's a diminution, we lose something also. So he was talking about in Rabbanis, that's not the point anymore to be the Gadol Adar, to be the Goyen Adar. It's good, it's very important. But he told me, Medaf Fashtein mentioned. And he told me in an incredible line, I believe it is printed someplace, but he told it to me.
What did he mean, Medaf Hashtain mentioned? That we have to understand people
he said, I'll tell you exactly what he said. He said that, so Farhana mentioned there are people that learn a sefer, and there are people that learn, Torah, whatever it is. Medaf lernen a mensch. That means to understand a person. And his understanding, we can call it psychology, but a Torah psychology of human beings was incredible. He just understood people way beyond any visible, let's say, psychosis or neurosis or symptoms. He went down deep into their neshama and then did what was good for them, what they needed. And so he decided that there's a story. I mean, I think it's made the rounds of the Chaim Berlin group, but I don't know if the rest of the world has heard it, where there was somebody that was planning to go into Kailul, and he pushed him into Chinuch. And it turned out that he had a very bad stutter. And he didn't think that he could go into Chinuch because he could not articulate. And the yeshiva very clandestinely and surreptitiously got somebody to do speech therapy with him without the person knowing that he was getting speech therapy. And they became a crackerjack superstar Rebbe. But he said that in Kailul, and he wanted desperately to go into Kailul, learn for a number of years like everybody else, but he said he would have gotten lost, and he would have been, I think he said, the Lashon was Abal Mum Farlebn. He would have been ruined for life. And the yeshiva knew what he needed, got it for him, and I guess by now the person found out.
But that's amazing that Rav Hutner had the koyach like his own Rebbe.
Yes.
To channel the talents and abilities of every Talmud in their individual way, sending this one to Rabbanos, this one to Chinuch, this one to Askanos, etc., etc. And that's something that we definitely miss, that koyach, to be able to direct youngsters. And with that, I'll come to our closing question.
Sure.
I think we could speak to the Rav for hours. I know I could.
I'm enjoying talking to you.
We could go on and on about Rav Hutner with stories. I'm sure there are many we didn't get to. Maybe we'll have to book the Rav for another session.
It would be my honor.
But
just about Rav Hutner.
Just about Rav Hutner. We appreciate you making the effort to come down here today.
Leave me out of the screen.
But whether it's from Rav Hutner, whether it's from Rav Mata Weinberg, from being in the Rabbanus, if there's a message that you could give over to those of a younger generation, and I'm including those who are already married with children, those who may have married children of their own, maybe bachrim, single girls growing up in a tumultuous world, what guidance, what piece of advice, what insight could you offer to us, having seen what you've seen, having experienced what you've experienced?
It's a tall order. It's a tall order, but it's a very good, wise question. I wish I had as wise an answer as the question is. But I would say that none of the people that I learned from had easy lives. And the yeshiva always, the yeshiva meaning Rav Hutner Zatzal, always bemoaned the fact, and this is in print, that when we write even ArtScroll biographies, sometimes skip the part that would illustrate and would help the younger generation to know that everybody goes through ups and downs. So the line that the yeshiva said was, and I published this myself, but in the yeshiva's name, that the Chafetz Chaim wrote his classic sefer to Chafetz Chaim when he was in his 20s, I believe, 25, 27, something, very young. So fast forward 50 years. Now the Chafetz Chaim is in his 70s. He's still writing Svarim. So you would say, wow, and if you're very from, oh, look at that. He was so brilliant when he was 25 that when he's 75, he's still writing great Svarim. No, he's so much better at 75. It's an insult to say to somebody that 50 years doesn't do anything for you.
The term, I think, is hagiographies, right?
Yes, yes.
Where you're skipping over the portions of growth and maybe even trial and tribulation. And I think that's what the Rav is referring
exactly. And he
to.
said this about the Chafetz Chaim. And I remember people didn't like it at the time. He said this publicly, by the way, in a mimer. He alluded to this, that who knew what the Chafetz Chaim's own struggles were not to speak Lashon Hara? Ooh, how could you say such a thing? No, on the contrary. So that is a very big chizuk, I think, to everybody that's struggling. Because that struggling, he said this so many times, struggling is a sign of life. No struggle is a sign of, unfortunately, of death and destruction.
We appreciate that hadracha. We appreciate this book. The book is a masterpiece. It's a blueprint for aliyah, for growth, for self-improvement. It gives a person a good feel when it's read. Each chapter is easy to read on its own, which is also what makes the book so appealing. Mitzvah Hashem, the book should sell well. The Rav should be zeichet to continued habatzas HaTorah, guiding people, influencing people, raising them up. Arichas Yom and Veshanim, thank you again for joining us.
Amen. Thank you, Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner.